For Valentine's Day this year I produced this wood-turned egg and then decorated its surface using the Rose Ornamental Lathe. This video will describe the steps in creating this egg, beginning with turning the laminated wood block on the lathe and then adding a series of decorations onto the surface of the egg using the Automated Rose Ornamental Lathe. The new universal egg holder, that I recently developed, was used to hold and position the egg for the cutting of the design patterns on the wood egg surface. I started out by cutting 2 walnut wood blocks. Each of these walnut blocks was 4 inches wide by 8 inches long by 2 inches thick. Thin laminated wood strips of contrasting colors were produced by slicing them on the bandsaw using my Accu-Slice system. The 2 walnut wood blocks and the thin laminated wood strips were then all glued together using Titebond 3 wood glue. After the glue had dried, I then cleaned up the wood block assembly to remove the excess glue and true up the outer surface. I then glued this assembly to a wood lathe faceplate. This assembly is now ready for turning. I then attached a rotating center point onto the tailstock on the lathe and positioned this center point against the wood block. This rotating center point is probably not needed, but it does give some additional support to the wood block and reduces some vibration. I first of all rounded off the corners on the wood block using a lathe wood gouge. For the remaining turning operations, I will be using 3 additional wood lathe chisels. I used 2 of the carbide-tipped cutters, one with a 1/2 inch diameter round carbide cutter and a second tool with a pointed tip carbide cutter. I also will be using a thin cutoff tool. For the remaining turning operations shown here, I repositioned the camera overhead. I have sped up this video 10 times the actual cutting speed, and I further edited the video to further reduce your viewing time. After the basic shape was completed, I pulled the tailstock away from the end of the wood block and continued to refine the top of the egg. I am cutting the base of the egg close to its final dimensions, but I am not cutting it off. I will cut the base block off the egg later after I transfer the egg to my vacuum chuck. I then sand the egg beginning with 100 grit sandpaper and then progressively using finer grits down to 400 grit. I then finish cleaning up the surface using some fine steel wool. Next I remove the wood egg with the faceplate from the lathe headstock and transfer the wood egg to a rotating adapter on the lathe tailstock. I then attached one of my 3D printed vacuum chucks to the lathe headstock, moved the egg to seat it into the mouth of the vacuum chuck and turned on the vacuum. The design of these 3D printed vacuum chucks was described in a previous video. Using this technique, I maintain the perfect alignment of the egg during the refinement of the base of the egg and also during the cutting off operation. I used a parting tool to cut off the base from the egg and then used one of the lathe chisels to refine the contour of the base of the egg. The vacuum chuck does hold the egg in place, but care must be used to not cut too aggressively or apply too much cutting pressure. I then used the same sanding procedures to finish the base of the egg. When finished, the vacuum is turned off and the egg is removed from the vacuum chuck. And here is the finished egg ready for its decorations. I will be using my new Automated Rose Ornamental Lathe to create design patterns on the wood-turned eggs. In order to hold and position the wood eggs on the Rose Ornamental Lathe, I will be using my recently designed universal egg holder. There is another video, which will be available shortly, which will fully describe the new universal egg holder for the Rose Ornamental Lathe. I mounted the wood-turned egg that I just finished into the universal egg holder. The egg is held in place between 2 egg support clamps and then clamped in place with 2 8-inch long screws with thumb nuts. Using this jig, the egg can be positioned up or down, left or right and also tilted or angled. This enables the precise positioning of the egg to enable the position of the decorations at any location on the sides of the eggs and orient the egg so that the design will be evenly cut on all sides of the design element. For the first design element I want to create the feature design element on the 2 center sides of the egg. This design element will be 2 inches in diameter and will include a heart symbol in the center and then a series of rotating rings surrounding the center heart. In order to obtain a smooth and even cutting of this design element, I will be creating this 2-inch diameter recessed dome on each of the 2 sides of the egg. I have mounted a 1/4 inch diameter milling cutter into the spindle motor mounted on the AXA tool post. I angled this cutter about 15 degrees in order to cut the dome shape. I also adjusted the position of the egg in the universal egg holder. adjusting it left and right and well as slightly tilting the egg in order to get the dome in the correct orientation on the egg and to enable equal depths of cuts on both the top and bottom edges of the egg. This takes a little bit of time to get the correct position, but I had created an alignment template to help with this adjustment. I proceeded to cut the desired dome shape, rotating the egg on the rose lathe shaft, making the cuts shallow towards the center of the dome and then deeper towards the outside edge of the dome. Since the cutting tool has a flat tip, this dome shape will not be perfect and does require some additional hand sanding after the cutting has taken place, in order to smooth out the edges between the cuts. But after a little sanding the dome shape is perfect, it is centered and it is recessed. I designed and 3D printed a rosette to create the heart-shaped design. I mounted this rosette on the rose engine, adjusted the size of the heart and adjusted the egg in the universal egg holder to position the heart in the center of the dome shape that I just created. I installed a pointed cutter on the spindle motor and made multiple depths of cuts to produce the required shape and depth of the heart-shaped design. Note that this video is sped up 20 times the actual cutting speed. I normally make all of my cuts on the Rose Ornamental Lathe at a rotation speed of 1 or 2 revolutions per minute. The cutting tool in the spindle motor is rotating at a speed of 8,000 revolutions per minute. Next I changed the rosette to a 12 sine wave rosette with an amplitude of 0.2 inches, or 200,000ths of an inch apart. I will be generating multiple passes of rings using this rosette. To create the pattern for this design, I cut 3 concentric rings each 200,000ths of an inch apart. This actually took quite a while. Since the rings are being cut on the surface of the dome that I had created earlier, each of the concentric rings will be cut to a different depth. Therefore, I needed to adjust the depth of cut for each of the rings as they were being cut. I then adjusted the phasing of the rosette by half a segment and then created 2 additional rings spaced between each of the previous rings. This produced the desired pattern. As a final step I cut a circular ring around the overall circumference of the dome created earlier and made this ring fairly deep. I then repeated this same design on the opposite side of the egg. To finish off the design for this project, I wanted to add a series of heart-shaped patterns to this design. I decided that I would add a total of 6 hearts surrounding each center design. Since there are designs on both sides of the egg, this meant that I would need to add a total of 12 heart patterns to this egg. I reinstalled the heart rosette to the rose lathe and I once again will be using the same pointed cutter in the spindle motor. I wanted a slightly larger heart pattern, therefore I increased the size of the heart pattern that was previously used in the center of the design. The heart patterns were created in 3 different setups or levels around the circumference of the egg. At each distance from the top or bottom of the egg, I adjusted the universal egg holder to set the distance of the heart pattern from the top of the egg and then adjusted the angle bar on the universal egg holder to get even cutting around the circular pattern on the egg. Again, this seems like it should be easy to accomplish, but as soon as you change the angle on the angle bar, the distance changes. So, it takes several attempts going back and forth adjusting the angle and the linear position of the egg to dial in the correct position on the egg. But once one of the heart pattern parameters has been set for the first heart pattern, then this same setting holds true for the remaining 3 hearts around the circumference of the egg. The only change that is needed for the remaining 3 hearts is to just rotate the egg in the universal egg holder to the correct position. For each of the remaining heart patterns, I once again adjusted the depth of the cut to achieve the desired appearance of the cut pattern. After the first level of 4 heart patterns was finished, this same process was repeated for the remaining 2 levels or sets of 4 heart patterns. I gave the egg a light sanding using a floppy disk sander to remove any fuzzies or small burrs. Here is the finished egg. As a final step, I gave the designed egg several coats of bush oil. The bush oil darkens the wood slightly and protects it from moisture. Thank you once again for watching this video. If you have any questions or comments, please leave them in the message box below or send me an email. Thank you.